So we're kicking off this panel this morning looking at the threats and opportunities for democratic renewal, which is a nice, light, easy way to ease us into this conference. Got an amazing lineup of speakers who really probably don't need an introduction, but I'll give them one anyway. We've got Neal Lawson, we've got Femi Oluwole, we've got Akiko Hart, and online we've got Dr. Hannah White. So thank you, Hannah, for joining us. So now each of our panelists is going to give their thoughts on threats and opportunities, and hopefully there'll be some good news in with the bad news, because it's going to be a huge year for democracy. We will almost certainly have an election here in the UK, but of course there's a US presidential election, elections in India, and European Parliament elections, which will no doubt influence the landscape in which we operate. And there's a lot of change and a lot of challenges. I think over the last decade, my bookshelf has filled up with books thinking about the death of democracy, and it's been perhaps slightly depressing that we've all probably in some way had to deal with democratic backsliding in a way that we might not have envisaged a decade ago. But there's also been huge progress in terms of democratic innovation led in this country by many of the people in this room. So some real highlights amongst some of the bad news as well. So a lot to chew over. So without further ado, I'll turn to our first speaker, to Neal, to take us through some of those threats and opportunities.
Thanks, Jess. It's really good to be here, and congratulations to the Democracy Network for the work that you've done over the last few years to pull people together, and to everyone in the room and everyone online and everyone who isn't here, who's been, ploughing that tough field of, trying to extend and deepen our democracy. I'm feeling a bit kind of tired and jaded, and it was cold on my bike on the way up here, and I'm going to try and get us going a little bit. Look, you all know the story about the child who cried wolf. They cry wolf and the villagers come and there's no wolf there, and they do that several times. No wolf appears, and then finally, of course, the wolf comes along and the child cries wolf and no one comes along. I think the child gets eaten. It's one of those great grim stories. But look, the wolf is coming. The wolf of brutal, rampant, authoritarian populism is coming, right? Okay? It's at the door. Nowhere. I don't know. I know you're not all on the left of politics, and that's absolutely fine and brilliant and dandy, right? But there is no social democratic, with the emphasis on the word democratic, party anywhere in the world on the front foot. Vibrant, transformative, pushing, shoving for a new and different kind of society. Where they stumble into government, they are on the defensive, right? Because there is no vibrancy and urgency to that kind of social democratic project, because our democracy isn't working. The planet is burning, the poor are getting poorer, we're entering a polycrisis world of climate, AI, care, polarization, you name it, right? It's coming down the track, and we don't have answers to it because our system doesn't have answers to it, because our system isn't working. And I think probably we are, I hope we get a change of government, right? But if that change of government is just holding the fort for a while they don't stop the planet burning and they don't stop the poor getting poorer, then the forces of the populist brutal right are just going to kind of gird their loins and come back even stronger and say, look, that centrist, pragmatic, mildly democratic stuff doesn't work. I'll tell you who to follow and who to hate, and let's go in this direction. And that is going on everywhere, right? So somehow we have to meet that challenge. We have to renew our democracy, not just in small, gentle ways. And look, there can be incremental things. I'm really in love with the term strategic incrementalism. I know it's really catchy and you'll all kind of be talking to each other about it, right? It's not that I expect a revolution. It's not that I expect any incoming government to change the whole democratic system overnight. What I do expect them to do is believe that democracy is the most important tool in any incoming government's toolbox to begin to change society and the world, right? And I think that instrumentally, for the reasons that Jesse said at the beginning, because without democracy, you don't make the right decisions. But intrinsically, I want them to know that as fully flourishing, wonderful human beings, the most important thing we can do is have the ability to shape the world around us collectively, right? And that we get benefit from doing that and behaving like that and thinking like that. Now, I would start, and and this is just a particular view, and start where you want, right? I would start with proportional representation, not because I think it's a panacea, right? There are no democratic panaceas. I think we over-egg stuff too much in this sector, right? But PR just unlocks, I said that for Tom Brake, unlocks, right? Unsticks our political system. It stops our whole system being dominated by the very rich, the very wealthy who donate to the parties and get the privileges and the honours. It stops a few media barons determining the whole debate, and it stops the whole kind of few swing voters in a few swing seats, and it allows us to kind of build a consensus and plan for the long term, right? Just as the first point. And of course, we all want to get rid of the House of Lords and have a written constitution and devolve as much as possible, but we have to go further than that. We have to get down to the levels of real kind of citizens' assemblies, of liquid democracy, of quadratic voting, of everything that gives us the democratic tools to shape our world, to deal with climate, to deal with the poor getting poorer, and to fend off the threat of the brutal populist right and everything that they stand for. And I don't think it's just about constitutional democracy. It's about economic democracy. It's about social democracy. It's about public service democracy. Willy Brandt, dare more democracy. We have to throw democracy into every, just as the right through the market into every possible conceivable space. We have to push democracy into every conceivable possible space. Look, this isn't going to happen easily. It's not going to happen quickly. Big power changes, big shifts in power never come from the top. Funny enough, the ones who climb to the top of the greasy pole quite like being there and don't want the rules to be changed. We have to understand that. We're not going to get what we want by asking nicely. We're going to get what we want by building arguments and forces and resources to push the case for a democratic, transformative change. And I think the wind's in our sail on this stuff, right? You've got the threat from the right, but so many people now are waking up. Activists, campaign organizations, civil society operators are waking up to the fact that democracy is a first order issue. Whatever you want, you ain't going to get it under this democratic system. You have to change the democratic system first to get whatever it is you want. Climate change, houses built, trade union rights, et cetera, et cetera. My little organization, Compass, recently, last year, signed up Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Green New Deal Rising, Tax Justice UK, Equality Trust, to the issue of proportional representation, because those organisations now know they are not going to get what they want under first past the post. Look at the Labour Party. Now, the leadership are against, the top of the party leadership are wholly against proportional representation. But look at the massive transformation in the membership, in the trade unions, of leaders like Andy Burnham. Everyone now is beginning to see democracy as a first order issue. So I think the wind is in our sails. That if we want to change the system, if we want to change society, we have to change the system. So we have to build, we have to argue, we have to be resolute, and know that if we don't do it, the wolf is coming and knocking at the door, if that's what wolves do, right? So it's really serious, it's really urgent, and that's why this conference matters, and that's why we have to go away and build the movement for change, and not just ask nicely.
Thank you, Neal. And I'm adding polycrisis to the other P's we need to be worried about, like polarisation and populism. Over to you, Akiko.
Thank you so much, and quite hard to come after you, Neal, so thank you for that. But listen, it's really, really lovely to be here with you today. This work is really hard, right? And one of the things that I always remember when I'm in a physical space with other people doing this work, and I know some of you, most of you actually, I don't know, and it's lovely to actually see so many new faces, is that it's through this kind of connection, this being together, the validation, the rousing cries, that we remember why we do this, and we get like a little bit of energy back, because it can be so exhausting. So really, really important to kind of hold on to these connections. So thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you for everyone at home for coming to this as well. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the right to protest, why it's under threat, but why I also think there's an opportunity here to reframe what we mean by protest. So I I think we can safely say that the right to protest is under threat in the UK. The current government has enacted a number of pieces of legislation over the past few years that have really threatened this right. That's through the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act, the PCSC Act, and also the Public Order Act. So there's a few examples of this. So for example, some of the new legislation has created new offences under protest. So for example, the Public Order Act, under the Public Order Act, there is a new offence of locking on or being equipped to lock on. So that means that you could be arrested for carrying some super glue or a belt if you're at a protest, which seems really, really far-fetched, right? Except that something really similar happened to the pro-Republican anti-monarchy protesters at the coronation last year, where they were arrested for having luggage straps, which they were using to secure their placards. So this isn't an empty threat. This has happened. This is continuing to happen. These powers are far too broad and far too ill-defined. So there's a number of new offences there. But what we're also seeing, the other end of it, is much harsher sentencing. So in July last year, the two protesters who scaled the Dartford crossing, I don't know if you remember this, and as a result of that, the crossing was closed for 40 hours. Their sentences were what's the word? Sorry, their sentence, they appealed to have their sentences changed, and that was rejected. So their sentences were upheld at the Court of Appeal in July. The judge deemed that the sentences were severe, but not excessive. Now, those sentences were 3 years for one individual and 2 years and 7 months for the other. They are the harshest sentences ever imposed on non-violent protesters in this country in modern times. So that is now the new normal, and that should be a warning to us all. So there's new offences, harsher sentencing, but we're also seeing this government push through legislation in a different way. So there's also something about protest there that I think we need, process that we need to be paying attention to. So I work as the interim director at Liberty, and Liberty is currently taking the Home Secretary to court for something around this. So after the Public Order Bill became Act, the government pushed through new powers that had been rejected by Parliament. So specifically during the debating of the Public Order Act in Parliament, there was a big debate about whether or not to change the definition of serious disruption, so the level at which the police could intervene, in a protest or march. That change was rejected by Parliament. But what happened after that is that the government, so the Home Secretary at the time, Suella Braverman, pushed it through what's called secondary legislation. So this is why we're taking her to court. And it's really, really interesting because it wasn't just people who really care about protest who were absolutely appalled by this. It was constitutional lawyers, because it attacked, the fundamental kind of division of powers within, our democracy. So why is this happening? Because I think it's really important sometimes to step back and think, well, why is the government cracking down on all of this? And I don't have an answer for you. I've got a couple of hypotheses. I mean, I think, something that's clearly come up over the last few years has been a rise in environmental activism, protests, climate justice activists. And those protests have been intentionally disruptive. And I don't use disruptive in a pejorative sense, because obviously the whole point of protests is that it's meant to be disruptive, because if you're protesting really, really quietly in a private room, you're probably not protesting very effectively. So those protests have been disruptive. I think that disruption has been both real and perceived. It's also been amplified by the media. And I think, it's fair to say that it's probably being used as a wedge issue. So I think there's definitely some of that, and some really reactive legislation in relation to that, which I think is so utterly dangerous. Some people say that this government isn't comfortable with criticism, which, I mean, I don't know, it gets a lot of criticism. It's probably used to it. I don't know, most governments kind of do in this country. I don't really think it's that. My instinct is that this government, and actually many governments, I don't think it's this particular government, are not comfortable with listening and engagement and being in dialogue. Because I think when they are seeing these big kind of protests, out on the streets, their initial reaction is to shut it down. because that dialogue feels too difficult and too kind of out of scope. So where do we go from here? So I think there is really an opportunity here to reframe protest. So, for example, at the moment, the way we tend to talk about protest in this country is that we tend to talk about it in relation to really big or national or kind of like international protests, like, you know, the current kind of pro-Palestinian marches, for example, which is totally fine. Those protests are, you know, are there, they're big, they're important. But protest isn't just about that kind of very visible front page protest. It can also be quite local and community based. So when we at Liberty reached out to our members and asked our members, you know, tell us your stories about protests, we were completely bowled over because people sent us pictures and stories of mainly local protests. So people protesting against the closure of their local library and people protesting against the felling of trees in a local forest. And that's the thing, if we bring this back to people, individuals, families, communities, I think we take the heat out of a lot of this and we connect this right to something that speaks to more people. And I think that that's something I'm really keen to do. I think, secondly, we need to push back against this idea that protest is fundamentally anti-British. Don't even know what that means, but like un-British or anti-British. Because you don't need to be a historian to appreciate that protest is part of our history. Now, I don't want to be an exceptionalist. Protest isn't just a British thing, obviously. But whether you look at, you know, Peterloo or the suffragettes or the general strikes after World War I, or Pride, or the CND marches, or the anti-war march, you know, during the Second Gulf War, protest is part of what we do, you know, and how we speak up and how we stand up to power. And anyone who is calling protests anti-British or un-British has ulterior motives. You know, so I think we really, really need to push back against that. So finally, what do I think? I think for me, the really important piece, I don't think it's just a comms piece. I think it's almost a kind of rethinking, reshaping piece, is to not just look at protest as being about disorder, because I think it's really easy to see that. I said like protest is inherently disruptive. But for me, I think the surge in protest that we're seeing isn't so much about disorder. It almost feels to me like it's the canary in the coal mine. It feels to me like a call to arms, a call to re-establish democratic order in a different way, because actually it's out of kilter at the moment. And I think for me, that feels like a much more hopeful and kind of generative way of looking at the current right to protest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akiko. That feels like a really important, sobering reminder of the situation we're in, but also very hopeful in terms of how we could change things. So thank you for that. Let me go next to Femi.
Hi, I'd just like to say I'm really quite hopeful, precisely because of how bad things are. Like the Gen Z term is F around and find out. You test how things could go, and then ultimately you find out and you learn the lessons. We've learned all the lessons we could possibly need to learn. Like, obviously my background is largely around Brexit. The background of that is largely because of massive regional inequality in the UK. The fact that the North, Wales, smaller towns, massively left behind. Meanwhile, London Underground system, all the investment, all the opportunities, they're here. That anger was felt across the country. And people like Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, they tapped into that anger and said, hey, the liberal metropolitan elites are getting all the benefits of the system, give the system a kicking, vote Brexit. And we've learned what they actually stood for. We've got a prime minister right now that literally bragged about defunding deprived areas in favor of rich ones. We've seen what the consequences of having an unfair voting system are. We've seen that if all votes had counted equally, the Tories would not have a majority. They got 44% of the vote. If all votes had counted equally, we wouldn't have gone through a pandemic led by somebody who said it's a good idea to shake hands with COVID patients. It is having a real effect on people's lives. You wouldn't have a government that is so deeply authoritarian. You mentioned the notion of protest being anti-British. That is textbook fascism. Like, look at the Encyclopedia Britannica, treating critics of your policies as less patriotic is textbook fascism. And we are in a position now where, because we've learned these lessons, we now have the ability to go forward and say, hey, if you want things to change, we know the way to do it. We know that if all votes counted equally, then, for example, we would still be in the EU because the majority voted for second referendum parties. We would have much more pro-climate parties in power, because right now, if you look at the Tories, they got 44% of the vote, but got 56% of the seats in Parliament. I think the Greens, when you compare that to the seat share to vote share, Green votes are worth 21 times less than Tory votes. So if you're trying to make the case for proportional representation, ask somebody who's in Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, how do you solve the climate crisis if Tory votes are worth 21 times more than Green votes? There is so much scope to make things better. And in terms of actually getting there, we've now got the Labour Party, at least the members of it, as Neal was saying, massively in favor of PR, of changing the voting system, because they voted overwhelmingly for it. And that, in terms of the country as a whole, consistent polling shows the majority of people are in favor of changing the voting system. That's where we are. And that conversation is being had and can be had. And I guess my main message here today is, here's how you have that conversation. A, by making the point that you want your votes to count equally, that Tory votes should not count 21 times more than Green votes, 30% more than Labour votes. That's the current state of affairs. But also, are we a democracy? Like, often big conversations in politics, they hinge on very simple ways of putting a concept. And if you ask the average person, would you consider a country to be a democratic country if the majority of votes had no effect on UK on their policy? They would say no. And in the UK, a party with a minority of the vote pretty much always gets majority control in Parliament. They get the majority of the seats, which means that a party with a minority can do anything they want without having to even talk to the other parties in Parliament, i.e. the parties that the majority actually voted for. So the majority of votes have no effect on UK policy. So under those circumstances, can you call it democracy? So if you can have that conversation, say the UK is not a democratic country, and get that conversation spread, then when we get that change of government in a few months' time, when Keir Starmer is there, as we said, the Labour leadership is not where we need them to be yet, then we have a situation where we know what the benefits of getting real democracy would be: better climate policy, better tax policy, a fairer country, actual social progress. We know that the majority of the Labour Party is in favor of PR. We know the majority of the country is in favor of PR. The only thing in the way of actually having a real democracy with real progress would be Keir Starmer. That conversation being had across the airwaves is huge pressure on him to do what we need him to do. And as for the actual shape of who we are as a country, that has been changing fundamentally. I know we are a broad church in here, but ultimately, because in, I think, every single election other than, I think it's 1955, 1959, and 2015, the majority of votes have gone to parties to the left of the Conservatives. So we're talking Labour, Lib Dems, SNP, Greens. That's where over 50% of the votes have been consistently. We are a progressive voting country, and yet in 47 of the last 77 years, the Tories have been the party of government. So we consistently get governments that are more right-wing than the actual people. So if we change the voting system to one where all votes count equally, we get automatically better, more progressive policies almost by default. And on top of that, the generational shift that we've had, because I think the Financial Times did the research and found that if you are boomer age, Gen X age, or silent generation age, at the age of 35, you are 5 points less conservative than the national average. But by the age of 70, you are 5 points more conservative than the national average. So that whole traditional trend of you get more conservative as you get older. However, millennials at the age of 35 are 15 points less conservative than the national average. We have seen a generational shift. It is going to be a massive acceleration of progress, especially when you combine that with a fair voting system. And so when you look at things like, why is that happening? It's largely because, to put it bluntly, in terms of politics, I'm putting that major qualifier in there, we no longer respect our elders. Because if you look at what our elders have done in terms of the voting that they've done in recent years, Brexit, Trump, Boris Johnson, the idea that we should look up to them. No, they're the people that, you know, crash the economy because of a poster they saw on a bus. Probably shouldn't go that way. And so that's why the younger generation is going a massively different way. If you look at what they're doing on TikTok, it is insane, the level of progress, the scope for progress. And I think my favorite thing about social media, especially these days, is if you look at TikTok, it allows us to tell our own stories, because traditionally the mainstream media has chosen which narratives to put which individual groups into. So for example, if you're talking about Black people, if you're talking about Muslim people, if you're talking about gay people, women, the mainstream media decides which stories to tell about those groups. However, now we can tell our own stories. Personally, as a Black guy, seeing other Black comic book hero nerds on social media has been so validating, because you just don't see that on the mainstream media. My favorite TikTok I've ever seen was a Muslim woman saying how one of her colleagues said the only Muslim she's ever met, only Muslims she's ever seen were Muslims on TikTok. And it wasn't, she didn't get her, so her only experience of Muslims is Muslims telling their own stories, not Fox News, not governments, not the bigotry of people around her. People telling their own stories and seeing what they are actually like. Like, it's so much harder to support invading another country, bombing another country, if the day before you saw that somebody from that country doing a makeup tutorial. People watching people is making people better. Anyway, the future is bright. The future is not red, it's not blue, it's not orange, it's multicolored. I'm happy for it.
Thank you very much. And I love how you've focused on conversations and stories, and how important those are to what we're all trying to achieve. So last but certainly not least, let me hand over to Dr. Hannah White from the Institute for Government. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can beautifully. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm so sorry not to be able to join you all today, but logistics of trains and things did not allow. So I'm joining you from kind of sunny Brighton. So I want to talk a bit about representative democracy and where that's at. And I was really struck by Neal's phrase, which he used, which I think he used last time I met him as well, and I think is a good one. This is one of strategic incrementalism. Because I think we've got to, when we're thinking about where we want our democracy to get to, we've got to start thinking realistically about where it's at now and how we might get it to change. And we, people in the room might want to see quite radical changes, but I think it's also really important to think about the smaller changes we need to make to the institutions we've got, which is where my focus tends to be. And I think, just going back to what we said at the start, that the how really matters. And I think what we have to realise about Parliament, and about the House of Commons in particular, is that it's had a really difficult decade as an institution. And where we are now, sort of a decade on from the Brexit referendum, it's quite a different place to where it was a decade ago. And I say that because its understanding of its own role, I think, has changed, and its expectations of people within the institution about how its processes work have changed. And I don't think there's necessarily sufficient acknowledgement of that. But the fact is that we have a set of politicians now working in Parliament who expect Parliament to work quite differently to how they did a decade ago, and in many ways, in my view, less well. And so what do I mean by that? Well, over the last decade, I think we've seen Parliament really struggle to manage conflict, which is cut across different lines to how it's been used. Parliament is set up to manage sort of interparliamentary bipartisan politics, and actually with Brexit first, and then since, we've actually seen a lot of smaller factions, divisions within parties, and we've seen how badly Parliament copes with trying to get things done when you have an issue like Brexit, which cuts across party lines, but also when you have small backbench groupings like the ERG, who are able to exercise quite a lot of power, even when a government has what is supposed to be the benefit of the first past the post system, a relatively large majority. And we've seen MPs learn the lessons of that, and other small groupings work out how they can exert influence over a majority party. So we've sort of got a system which is set up, which is supposed to work for bipartisan politics and for large majority politics, but really isn't working that way anymore. I think we also have to see things from the point of view of MPs. MPs ought to be some of the sort of best supporters of democracy. Obviously, a representative form of democracy, and many people in the room, I think, would like to see many more sort of participative methods used and a much more grassroots democracy. But people who are in Parliament fundamentally, they do believe in a democratic system, but they are struggling too, because I think we've seen increasing antipathy towards MPs, towards these people who have, decided to make a career in our political system. We've seen physical violence, we've seen violence in social media, and I think that is really shaping the choices of people who want to go into politics at all, and that is really worrying. So that is shaping the nature of our politics. And if you look at the list of many of the people who are choosing not to stand at the next election, I think there'll be some people who will really miss from the democratic scene, as well as some of those who've already left over the last decade. But we've also seen Parliament very much sidelined within our system, and the other speakers have spoken to this. We saw it first with Brexit, with Theresa May trying to sort of push through her deal, and then Boris Johnson, of course, sort of not giving Parliament a proper role. Then we saw COVID, where the government had to legislate to begin with at speed, but then got quite a liking for being able to legislate at speed. And now, when you see the government bring forward what are really substantial policy issues to do with, say, changing our whole immigration system, and saying, but we're going to do this in a week, and Parliament's not going to have the opportunity really to scrutinise. When I worked as a parliamentary clerk in Parliament 20 years ago, a bill like the illegal migration bill would have gone into committee for 20 sessions and be scrutinised line by line, and MPs would really have had the opportunity to have their say over it. But now legislation is about campaigning far too often. I think it's about being able to say we're doing something. And I don't know enough about the topic, but when I listen to the debate about the Post Office Horizon scandal at the moment, and it seems to be everyone wants to reach for the answer is to legislate. Well, that might be the case, but I think we too often see legislation as just a sort of sticking plaster answer that the government can say it's going to do a thing, without having that proper parliamentary engagement in thinking through, is this a good idea? Is it going to work? Where are the pitfalls? Because it gets rushed through. And as one of the other speakers was saying, Parliament's taking increasingly broad powers to do things. Government's taking broad powers to do things in legislation, which Parliament then doesn't have an opportunity to scrutinise those individual decisions. So I think Parliament has been sidelined. MPs are demoralised, and lots of good people no longer want to be involved in politics, and the whole system is not really working properly as it's supposed to do. So I think, but I think there is ground for optimism. Having said all that, we have an election coming up. We have a set of people leaving, which means we have a new generation joining Parliament. And there is an opportunity for a revival of the institution, I hope. But I think that means democratising Parliament itself. It means giving Parliament a say over its own agenda. So it's not just always up to the government to decide what it gets to debate. I think there needs to be a bigger focus on the role of MPs as legislators, so that they actually get the opportunity to scrutinise and to put forward their constituents' views about what the government is trying to do in terms of legislation. I think it was Neal mentioned, the importance of sort of upholding ethical standards, so that Parliament can show itself to be a place that upholds the highest standards, rather than as an exception to every rule that everybody else has to follow. But I also think Parliament really needs to reflect on how it engages with the public. It's not enough anymore to just say, oh, we're all constituency MPs, we bring the experience of our constituents to Westminster, and that's a good enough democracy. Actually, what I think all your organisations are demonstrating is that the expectations from the public of our democracy are different now. People want to engage. People want to do that grassroots protesting, as Akiko was talking about. People want to feel that they should have a greater say than just voting once every 5 years and sending somebody to Westminster. And Parliament needs to reflect on that and think, you know, everybody says the select committee system is great, and it is, but is, you know, saying we're going to investigate a topic and here's a terms of reference, and if you want to tell us what you think about it, well, then you can write to us. Is that really how people expect to engage with their MPs these days? How do MPs need to think about the evidence that they gather and the views that they get? And so how can the sorts of experiments which have started in a very small way, the Justice Committee looking at sentencing guidelines, the big climate change assembly that happened, how can those experiments with participative deliberative methods which have started get to be more mainstream? How can we persuade more MPs that actually that's a way of enhancing our democracy rather than supplanting their role, which is how too many of them see it, I fear. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That's a really, really interesting perspective to round off our panel contributions. So now we're going to open up to the floor for a discussion. My briefing says that both comments and questions are welcome, so go wild. But please do keep your comments and or questions quite concise so we can get as many people in as possible. I'm sure you're as stimulated as I am by the challenges that have been set out. So stick your hand up if you have a comment or a question. Okay, so I'm going to take 4. I'm going to take, just to make you run around with the mic, we'll have this lady in the pearl sweater, and then let's go to Helen at the back, and then Titus down here at the front, and then Josiah after that.
Thank you very much indeed, really thought-provoking contributions. My name's Millicent Scott Brooks, and I'm from Make Votes Matter, which is the national campaign for proportional representation. So I wanted to say thank you for talking about proportional representation and the importance of getting that as our system for electing our MPs. This is a comment, which I will keep brief, but please do join the national campaign, Make Votes Matter, and encourage your networks to do so as well. We have made great progress over the last few years and look forward to continuing to do so that we can, together with your support, win PR. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Helen. I'm the Advocacy and Campaigns Lead at the Democracy Network, but I'm also an activist, so really appreciated your comments on the right to protest, Akiko. I was thinking about how we can repeal these laws, because it seems extraordinarily obvious to anyone with a vague view. If it's come back, there we go. Okay. That it's at odds with Articles 18 and 19 of our Human Rights Act and in international treaties like the ECHR and ICCPR. And obviously it's therefore not surprising that these laws have come as a wider challenge to human rights as a concept and an attempt to delegitimize them. But obviously we have in our history of protest in the UK also a strong history of case law where activists have taken those cases to the ECHR and they've had their appeals upheld. And I was wondering if that sort of approach is one that Liberty is taking, and particularly with the cases you mentioned where there have been really severe punishments applied to people. And if so, what sort of evidence Liberty and the other sort of progressive legal organizations need? Because obviously some of the key legal challenges were around a chilling effect or discriminatory impact. And if you have, would it be helpful to have evidence of that impact on activists for such a case?
Thanks, Helen. We'll take 2 more questions and then I'll hand over to our speakers to respond.
Hi, thanks, Titus Alexander. Just great speeches. I just want to pick up on the point that Neal made about the need for democracy to be across government as a means of delivering and improving the way our country works. And in particular, this time, when we met last time, the Brown Commission report had just been published. It made a number of recommendations, and it said in particular, Labour needs to talk and consult and develop proposals beforehand. And so my question is there anybody there in Labour doing it? And what more do we need to do, apart from making a racket, to get serious engagement with democracy and deeper democracy as the way in which we do government and run Britain. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Josiah Mortimer from Byline Times. I got the impression that probably most of you on the panel think that Labour will win the election this year. Is that fair to say? What's the kind of route to the Labour Party introducing proportional representation? I mean, obviously we've seen a big campaign within the Labour Party, overwhelming majority of members backing PR now. What is the next step for Keir Starmer getting on board with PR? Do you think that's possible or likely? I realise this is something that you debate every single day, but good to get some clarity on that. And then I guess a similar point on protest laws. I mean, do you see any hopes or signs of positivity or, I guess, glances towards reform from the Labour Party on repealing some of that anti-protest legislation over the past few years? Thanks very much.
Brilliant, thank you. Can I first go to Akiko to answer those questions on the legal challenge around protest laws, and then Neal, perhaps you could answer that specific question around the Brown Commission and who's in Labour, and then Hannah, I'm sure will have something to say on the next election and Labour's programme there. And I know the Institute for Government have done a great report on the consequences of PR from a constitutional perspective. And Femi, perhaps you could respond to those as well afterwards. So first over to you, Akiko.
Thank you. So yes, at Liberty, we do strategic litigation. It's a really important part of what we do. It's slow, deliberative work. Some of it takes years. But at the end of it, when you get a result, that result counts. And it feels like a really, really important piece of work, a strand of work for us to continue investing in. We currently are not working with any of the kind of Republican kind of anti-monarchy protesters that I mentioned, and we're not working with the two protesters who scaled the crossing. If you're interested in kind of figuring out who is working on that, I can find out and let you know. So if you drop me an email, I can do that and connect you. So your question was, how can we support this work? So I'm going to come at it from a slightly different perspective, I guess. So I said this work is really important. You're absolutely right about, the case law that we've built up around this. At the moment, though, there are also political dangers around some of this. So, in the run up to the Rwanda kind of judgment coming out, which was it December now? It felt quite perilous in many ways, because actually going to Strasbourg or invoking Strasbourg, in the current context with the Tory party, where it's at with its kind of internal discourse around the European Court of Human Rights, actually feels quite dangerous. So yes, it is something we're doing. It's something we're continuing to do, but it also feels fraught with dangers. So yeah, if you get in touch with me, I'd be really glad to kind of like put you in touch with others around it. And shall I speak to the legislative point, which I think both of you made? So we haven't had many policy commitments, have we, from Labour about much? And we certainly haven't got anything about repealing either act, which I think at this point is quite unlikely. Things can change, but they're not making any commitments, in that vein at the moment. I thought what was hopeful was, I don't know if any of you caught it, but that do you remember the protests around the cenotaph, around the time of Remembrance Sunday? And on the Friday, there was a mirror splash, which basically had a picture of the cenotaph saying, the right to protest is, it basically kind of said a little bit of what I said. It's kind of like the right to protest is kind of British. And, these people fought for our liberty and our right to protest. And then it had a little caveat about how it should do so, and people should also do so in a nice and thoughtful way. But that was basically the gist of the Mirror front page. And I think there is an opening there within Labour, whether you go down that route or whether you go down the trade union route, because actually, what is the difference between protest and industrial action? And I think actually it kind of falls within the same kind of ballpark, right? To kind of have a different conversation about protest within Labour, but I think we need to come at it differently.
Thank you. Yeah. Over to you, Neal.
Look, I think I'm going to be really, really realistic about this. And I think we have to be, because we can kid ourselves and think that if we ask nicely, we might get what we want. The current leadership of the Labour Party are implacably opposed to proportional representation. Implacably, right? They're not stupid. They're quite clever people, really, because they know that if you introduce electoral competition into the British democracy system, you'll get splits in the Labour Party, you'll get new parties, and they won't be able to dominate, either occasionally in government when the Tories are tired, or and fall over the line first for a while, or be in opposition and get all the spoils of Her Majesty's opposition, short money, cars, PMQs, etc. They are not going to allow it to happen, right? They don't want it to happen. They want an abusive relationship with people in the Labour Party who can't go anywhere else because there's nowhere else to go to, because it's the least worst option and that's all you can have. And they want to extend the same abusive relationship to the electorate. You've got no one else to vote for. Hold your nose and vote for us. Why on earth are they going to give that power away? They're not going to give it away. It's got to be taken from them. They've got to be forced. Now, I don't know how that happens, Josiah, exactly what the sequence of events is, but asking nicely and thinking that you can pass by a massive majority at party conference that they just ignore, and they will go on ignoring it, right? Now, there will be a crisis in British democracy and British politics because the planet's burning and the poor are getting poorer, and they're clamping down on protesters, and because they know all of this is bubbling up. That's why they're doing it, because they know that, if the democracy is not working and people are suffering, then they're going to protest. Well, they'll just keep on playing whack-a-mole everywhere, but they won't be able to contain it all. Right? They won't be able to contain people's demands, and they're feeling that things are going wrong. That's why I fear the right, because that's the position the country is more likely to go in unless we present a democratic alternative. So there'll be a crisis. It will be around something like a second election, right? If Labour doesn't win by that much, and I think, I don't know what's going to happen with the polls, right? But there'll be some kind of governing crisis in some shape or form. And in that crisis, like a second election, which is not convincing, which lays things open, which there are opportunities to intervene and say, we can't go on like this. And if we bring civil society with us, if we bring the business community with us, they want planning, they want long-term, they want infrastructure, they don't want this continued chaos, right? We have to build this coalition of people that in the moment when it's right to strike, Milton Friedman said, in the crisis, politicians look for the ideas that are laying around them. Have we built the ideas and the movements and the forces and the arguments to push for real democratic change? That's what we've got to do. And from this conference onwards, build the arguments, build the forces, build the resources, be ready for the moment when we can strike and deepen our democracy. That's what we've got to do.
Thank you, Neal. And Hannah, would you like to add anything to those questions?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I totally agree with Neal that PR is not going to be in any party's manifesto, and so it's really difficult to see whatever the outcome of the election, whether it's an unclear, narrower result than lots of people are expecting, or if you end up with that leading to a second election in a short period of time. It's really hard to see how PR gets on the table at this point. And if it's not in a manifesto, then it's not going to come out as a deal between parties. If we had a confidence and supply deal or a coalition or something, it's not going to be there. So I don't work on this day in, day out, but in the discussions I've had with people, I find it hard to see a clear, convincing route in the short term. On the other hand, I find it really striking how much stronger the grassroots call for PR has become in recent years, including in the Labour Party. And I think Neal is right that the question that we looked at the Institute for Government, sort of struck by recent experience, if you like, was well, if you did get it, what would it mean for our constitution? How would it mean we had to change how we operate? We can all think about what we think the pros and cons of it would be in terms of democratic outcomes, but actually we wrote this report which looked at the practical questions about what it would have to mean for how we form governments, how we organise parliament, how we make policy, and all these other questions. Because if you look around the world at PR systems around the world, which most other countries have, they don't all work that well, and they don't all produce the outcomes we would necessarily like to see. And so focusing too much on an objective and not thinking about the aftermath, I think, is a lesson we all ought to have learnt in recent years. And therefore, I think that's something important for us all to think about.
Thank you. Femi, any last thoughts on that question or any of the others?
Yeah, on the route to PR, entirely agree with you, Neil, in terms of Labour's opposition to it. The reason I was kicked out of the party was because after being very, very non-partisan during the Brexit years, I tweeted out to anybody in Lib Dems and Greens who's disappointed in me joining Labour, just know that my main objective is to get Labour to commit to electoral reform and an electoral pact on that basis. And that got me kicked out of the Labour Party because apparently even acknowledging that an electoral pact might help other parties was deemed to be a complete betrayal. So I do understand the need to actually make this by political force, essentially. And that will involve things like, that's why the phrase that I came up with is, the UK is not a democracy. Keep it simple, because that kind of argument, you can't argue against it. If the majority of votes have no effect on UK policy and Keir Starmer is continuing to support that position, he shouldn't be able to get through a single interview without somebody asking me, hey, Keir, why do you think the majority of votes in the UK shouldn't count? Have him ask that question every single time he's on stage. And as for what was the other thing, yes, how do we actually make that? There's already movements, like the Movement Forward is a campaign group which is really pushing to deal with tactical voting. They're Stop the Tories.vote people. They're working with Carol Vorderman, and also Make Votes Matter hugely. There's going to be, I know that those groups like that will have what's called pledges to sign, i.e. we'll give you your vote if you are committed to giving us PR when the time comes. Because the main thing is the excuses are about to go. After we've heard, for all of us in this room, we've heard Labour say things along the lines of, but we can't oppose Brexit, we can't support PR because we have to get the Tories out, that's the top priority. Yeah, that excuse disappears after the election. Everybody in Labour who's been saying that excuse goes. So if you ever want to have a progressive society, if you ever want to have a fair voting system, that will be the time.
Thank you. Now, I think we've got time for one more quick round of questions and quick responses as well, and we'll do our best. So I'm going to take question down here, and then lady at the back, and then James. Okay. Oh, a Zoom one. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize we're doing Zoom questions. Excellent. Okay. And then we'll take this gentleman here at the front. Thank you.
Thanks to the panelists for an amazing, diverse set of views. I wanted to ask to what extent you see the establishment of a common set of facts as a big democratic challenge at the moment. And I'm thinking particularly around the climate crisis, where I think part of a hypothesis around why that's been a focus of protest is because democracy is about establishing kind of common agreement, political reality, negotiation, and as I think it was James Hansen, the climate scientist, said, physics doesn't negotiate. The rate of change of institutions, the kind of real response that would be required to deal with the facts of where we are on that one issue is beyond our kind of political reality at the moment, and whether you think that, how you think that might play out in our kind of current poly crisis.
Oh, right. Sorry. Hi, yeah, I'm Liz. I work at Centenary Action. And I just wanted to raise the point about you're talking about threats to democracy. And one of the things that we see as something that's undermining our democracy is the sort of underrepresentation of women, with women only being 35% of MPs, but 51% of the population. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that as a threat to democracy. Thank you.
And we've got our online questions.
Charlie, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me, James? Or can you?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, that sounds good. Good to test the system out. Actually, no. The question is, in view of Neal covering much of the threats over the next 4 to 5 years from a very dynamic global populist right, where does he currently think the UK will be in terms of actual progress by then, as opposed to what we all might actually want? And despite a possible Tory civil war, where will the still big block of stop the boats voters open to populist narratives be on democracy issues by then as well?
Thank you, Charles. And then the last question from this gentleman here at the front. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is David Allen. I'm the leader of the Fairer Voting Party. That's a brand new party, so you'll have never heard of it. I can ask, are you okay with being disagreed with? Is that all right?
We welcome that in a democratic setting, absolutely.
Because I sense this is a bit of a loving of the left. I was rather expecting, I'm disappointed actually, because I was rather expecting slightly more intellectual depth in terms of what democracy actually means and how to achieve it and ways to do that, because there are ways to do it. I can tell you that because I've written a book on it, and that's what the party is on, which is radical change. But one of the other things which is concerning is that you've drifted away from strategic achievement of a more democratic process, whatever you decide that is, to include your own pet ideologies. You know, I want this to happen, I want that to happen. It almost seems like you like a system that kind of meets what you would like ideologically. Whereas what I've done and presented, and it's all there, is something which solves most of the problems that you're talking about. Particularly, you're smiling, yeah, because you think, oh, how can some guy I've never heard of actually come up with something that's any good? Why were you smiling then? Okay, so if you leave your ideology out, it's a lot clearer to see where you're going democratically. I had to laugh actually because Femi, you criticise the Conservatives because of the vote share they get and the seats they get, but you didn't use the information which is probably even more devastating, is that they only needed 5.5 million votes to get an 80-seat majority. They got more votes than that, but all the other votes were wasted. They might as well have been thrown in the bin. 5.5 million.
Can we wrap the question or comment up so we can give our
panellists time to respond? Sorry about that.
Okay, so working in reverse, and if I go to each of our panelists to respond to whichever ones they like on that, and then just wrap up with a final thought as well. So we have in reverse order the desire for more intellectual depth from our panel. We have the reality for the question online was the reality of the progress we might make and the reality of the populist threat as well. And then question again on underrepresentation in our politics, particularly of women, but also of many directions as well, and facts in political discourse and the issues around that. So if I start with you, Femi, and then we'll go in the reverse order.
Okay. Lack of intellectual depth. On that point, you talked about that we focus too much on the ideology and the actual objectives we want to achieve rather than the system of changing the system in order to make it fairer. The problem is, as I mentioned, that evidence of how the system doesn't work is because the ideology of the government is consistently not in line with that of the people because of how the system works. So if the majority is consistently voting for parties that A, have no power, and B, are to the left of the government we end up getting, that's an ideological mismatch between the people and the politicians. So the ideology, we're mentioning that as to prove the point that this system doesn't work. As for how we get more facts, that is a major problem, because especially if you've seen the TV show The Capture, we have major problems in terms of AI. We have major problems in terms of the mainstream media. I mean, in fact, we've had a reversal, because it used to be the case that you would have your information told to us on the mainstream news channels, and then the social media would talk about it. Now, the mainstream media is giving us opinion, and the social media is where you find the facts. It's messed up. So we do have lots of work to do on that point. Other points?
Just final thoughts.
Yes. Make sure you get everybody you know registered to vote. That is the main thing. Like, especially Gen Z, and especially know about the rules about having photo ID. That is your job. Have that conversation about how the UK is not a democracy. Have that conversation about why does the leader of the opposition or the new prime minister to be possibly think the majority of votes shouldn't have an effect on UK policy. Have those conversations.
Thank you very much. And moving to Hannah next.
Sorry, I'm just struggling to get my mute off. I was just going to comment on the first question about having a common set of facts. I think that is really important, and I think it's something where populism is a real threat, but can be checked in some ways if you start to find ways to secure a stronger set of agreement on facts. I think the Climate Change Committee is an example of an institution which tried to do that. The OBR is another example of an institution where you try to say, taking out of politics, these are just the facts about how the economy is working. And I think those institutions, as we saw with Liz Truss's premiership, are important and need to be defended and built up. And in fact, we may need other such institutions where we can say, you know, politicians, you can differ on the ideology and what you would do with this set of facts, but these are the facts. So I think that is a really important thing to think. And just linked to that, I think the other thing that I'm concerned about is this question of lying in Parliament, and the increasing readiness of politicians to think it doesn't matter if they say things which are misleading or by omission. They don't mention things that they in fact know. And that is another way in which the processes of Parliament have actually changed quite significantly without necessarily everybody realising that is the case. And I think that's something we need to keep a really strong focus on. I know Full Fact have done trying to campaign on that, but it's something that worries me quite a lot.
Thank you, Hannah. Akiko, final thoughts and answer those questions.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for your points about the underrepresentation of women. Really, really important. I don't have an answer for you. What it kind of led me to think about was that we've talked a lot about voting today in relation to democracy, but not everyone in this country can vote. And it feels to me really, really important that we expand, when we're talking about democracy, that we don't just talk about it in terms of voters, although that's incredibly important, but we expand some of these definitions a little bit more so. And we perhaps, interrogate why, not just why so few people vote out of the people who are eligible, but who we are allowing to vote in this country.
Thank you. Finally to Neal.
Yeah, I'm not. So on the was it Charlie who asked the question about the right? I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in the election. We've all said, we don't know, probably Labour's going to win. But, Boris Johnson won 2019, 80-seat majority. Things move really fast and really quickly now. This is a really febrile atmosphere that we're working in. Reform UK, obviously they support proportional representation. Of course they do. The travesty, the injustice of 2015, where UKIP got nearly 4 million votes and only 1 seat. And that was abhorrent, and we should all be condemning a system because it just bubbles up into Brexit. They get their kind of, the establishment against us, and it is, and it was, and it comes out in another place, in darker, worse places, right? You've got to accept other people's views and other people's voices, in democracy. And I'm not, to come to, was it David's points, look, I believe in a democracy that works for everyone, that is fair, that is constitutional, that is open, that is transparent, et cetera, et cetera. But, I'm a Democrat, because I'm an egalitarian. I'm a Democrat because I want to make sure that we live in a world where children can breathe air and the floods aren't lapping at our doors, right? I'm a Democrat mostly because I believe in the innate beauty and wonderfulness of people who, given fair systems and fair chances and fair resources and a proper democracy fit for the 21st century, will make the right kind of decisions. That's why I'm a Democrat. But I completely accept that other people will have different versions of what the good society is. The future that we want is one that we will negotiate together, not one that will be imposed by anyone, right? And to come out with a statement that says this is just about what works. Well, what works for who, for how, when, in what terms? These are all deeply political issues, that we need to discuss and negotiate and have a system to allow everyone's voices heard. Black people, women, gen whatever, you know, where everyone's voice is heard and everyone's voice counts and everyone's opinion is included in the conversation. You know, and that's when we're going to stop the poor getting poorer and climate changing in disastrous ways. So that's why I'm a Democrat. I come from it. You can call it. I'm obviously left wing, right? You know, and I understand other people have other motives. You know, but I want to change the system, not just for changing the system's sake, but because I want to change society. And I know that we can't change society unless we change the system. And that's why this conference is so important.
Thank you. And thank you to all those fantastic comments and questions. And I think it's set us off on a really great place to start this conference. So thank you all for joining in. And thank you so much to our brilliant panelists for their inspired thoughts this morning. Thank you very much.